Welcome everybody who has joined the call. My name is Don Kanak. I am the chairman of the EU-ASEAN Business Council and will be the moderator for this session. I do appreciate everybody joining from wherever you are joining. I assume you are in some state of lockdown or restricted mobility, and I know it's been a difficult time, as you may have heard us discussing, where some of the speakers are located. It's been very long periods of and very challenging periods as we've all been facing this pandemic. Over the last 8 weeks, the EU-ASEAN Business Council has held 6 webinars ranging over a number of topics from trade facilitation and supply chains to sustainability and the circular economy. And we were thinking as we were going along that at some point it would be good to start a conversation around recovery. Of course, there was the point of view, well, it's too early to talk about recovery because we're still in lockdown. The epidemic is still continuing. Some people are talking about a second wave, and we don't have a vaccine yet. But we did think it was timely, at least to start a conversation about recovery, at least for 2 reasons. One is, I think we all recognize, and I believe we'll probe this more today in our discussion, that the recovery is going to be difficult. This is an unprecedented set of circumstances that everyone is facing, and governments have had to take unprecedented actions, and we have more to come. And secondly, it's very likely that this recovery will have to be different in certain respects, in that we've all learned through the changes that we've had to, in the ways we've had to adapt over the last several months, that now, as the ways we work, the ways we play, the ways we are entertained, all of these things have changed, and there are certain those changes which have been accelerated. So it's very likely that the recovery is going to be different, say, than the recoveries we've seen in the past. In order to get at these issues, you have to have an all-star cast of speakers, and so we've been able to assemble the all-star cast today, and I'm just be more thankful of the 3 speakers that we have, and I'll introduce them in just a second. But before I do that, let me just talk a bit about the ground rules. I just want to emphasize 3 points. One is that all of the people except the speakers will be on mute. So we apologize to everybody, you're on mute, but it's not that we don't want you to ask questions, it's just that you have 100 people on a call. We all know that one set of background noise can really disrupt everyone else's ability to hear. So everyone will be on mute today, but we do want questions. So please use the question function on your Zoom so that we can track questions, and we want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for those questions to be answered by, or at least approached by, our speakers. And then the third point I want to mention is this is being recorded. I guess we'll make it available as a link on the website for those who couldn't attend, or maybe someone will correct me on that. We're certainly, it is being recorded, I guess, for posterity's purposes. Let me quickly introduce our speakers, and then we can get right into it. First, I want to say a few words. I think you all have seen biographical materials we circulated, so I won't go through the very exceptional biographies in detail. But first, His Excellency Cesar Purisima, who is an Asia Fellow of the Milken Institute and the former Secretary of Finance of the Republic of the Philippines, and is founding partner of IKHLAS Capital. From 2010 to 2016, Cesar was Secretary of Finance of the Philippines, and that was a very historic time, as you remember from the Philippines. It was the time that the Philippines received its first investment grade ratings. And I know from my personal engagement, in the Philippines and in the region during that period of time that Cesar's leadership in that time and that initiative played a very important role in the confidence building, not only with rating agencies, but with many financial institutions and I'd say the world financial community. And it's not surprising, therefore, that he was named the Finance Minister of the Year 7 times. So a truly extraordinary achievement. And also, I would just say one more thing in the sense of I think he brings a unique perspective to this conversation, because he's somebody, I think that today the term is triple strength leadership, a person who's had deep leadership experience, not only in the public sector, but also in the nonprofit sector, where he serves on boards in the nonprofit sector. And he also had an extraordinary private sector career as in the consulting and financial profession, and was a member of the Global Executive Board and the Global Practice Council of Ernst & Young, and chairman and country managing partner of the Philippines' largest professional services firm, SGV and Company. So thank you, Cesar, for joining us today. And I think people understand a bit from that background, the unique perspective you bring. Tan Sri Dr. Rebecca Fatima Santa Maria, the executive director of the APEC Secretariat, is also joining us today. Dr. Rebecca was, prior to taking on and actually becoming the first woman executive director of the APEC Secretariat, was a top-level Malaysia civil servant, trade negotiator, and academic. She was Secretary General of the Malaysian Ministry of International Trade and Investment from 2010 to 2016. And in addition to overseeing international trade policies and positions for the country, she was the chief negotiator for bilateral and regional free trade agreements, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. And we're going to be talking about ASEAN and recovery today. I think Dr. Rebecca also brings some unique perspective to this, having chaired the body that drafted the ASEAN Economic Community's 2015 blueprint, as well as the ASEAN Economic Community 2025 blueprint. So we thank you very much, Dr. Rebecca, for joining us, and we look forward to your comments. Last but not least, I want to introduce Joseph M. Calcaterra. Joseph is the chief economist for ASEAN, for HSBC, and he's based in Hong Kong, but he has an extraordinarily broad background, having had direct experience in Latin America, in China, in Korea. So he's covered Pan-Asia and beyond that before he took on the role as the chief economist for ASEAN. He is a CFA charter holder and he speaks 6 languages. I have not had the pleasure of working directly with Joseph as I have had with Dr. Rebecca and with Cesar, but I have seen him on commentaries on TV and enjoyed his presentation skills and his insights. And so with that said, I'd like to call on Joseph to kick us off today. Each of our speakers will speak for about 7 or 8 minutes as introductory remarks. Joseph will kick us off, give us some context on the economic front, and then we'll be followed by Cesar and then Dr. Rebecca. And then we'll have plenty of time, probably 25 minutes at least, for questions and answers. So please keep your questions coming in as we go along, and we'll be curating them and bring them up later. Joseph, may you take it away.
Thank you very much, Donald, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and I'm pleased to be here, particularly among such distinguished speakers. So I'll quickly go through some of our views on Southeast Asia, where Philippines finds itself in the region, and a little bit of comparative outlook, not only with the virus, but the outlook as we emerge from this virus situation. Now, perhaps unlike other parts of the world and even Asia, it's a bit too early to say that kind of Southeast Asia has emerged from the virus. There still are, of course, risks of not only second waves, but even containment of the first wave. And I think you could probably put the region into 2 buckets. You have economies like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand, which have done a pretty good job of containing the overall number of cases, and where we can say with relative confidence that these economies are at least on a bit of a stronger footing now as they emerge. And then there is, I would say, Indonesia, Philippines, and Singapore, where there has been, let's say, a sharper increase over the last few weeks. Of particular concern, particularly in the last few days, has been Indonesia, where the curve has steepened quite notably. And it's also interesting that Indonesia is, of course, one of the only countries in the region not to have a full lockdown. So there definitely is a degree of correlation here between the economic impact and the ability to contain the virus. One way we can actually look at the way that governments are using policies, restrictive policies, is actually a tracker from Oxford University. And actually here you can see that particularly in the last few weeks, it's actually the Philippines which has the most restrictive policies when it comes to lockdowns. Philippines is the black line, which you can see is very near almost 100, which is an index showing the degree of restrictiveness. And again, given that the lockdown has lasted so long, that is a testament to that answer. So you see the Philippines is most restrictive. Indonesia is actually least restrictive here, and it does, in a sense, reflect how the cases have emerged. This is just a table looking at lockdowns across the region. The red is a hard lockdown, pink is a partial lockdown. Not very quantifiable. There's a bit of subjectivity here, but you can see by and large it's actually been Philippines, Malaysia, and Singapore which have done the most in terms of shutting down domestic populations. And of course, the high frequency economic data doesn't really do too good of a job of allowing us to track how economies are responding to these lockdowns. So we've been having to use a lot of more creative data sources. So for example, Google has very good mobility data, which essentially tracks people's searches or their mobility away from their residences. And actually, when you look at the share of time that's been spent outside of residences, you can actually see the Philippine economy has actually faced the biggest economic slowdown here. There's been roughly a 60% decline vis-a-vis the baseline in terms of Filipinos going to businesses, retail activities, schools, universities, and needless to say, that has already been reflected in the growth data. So, for example, the Philippines enacted a lockdown around 18th of March for the first time, roughly the same time as Malaysia, a little bit earlier than Singapore. But actually, the Philippines economy, even in the first quarter with only 2 weeks of lockdown, saw a contraction in private consumption, a contraction in sequential GDP growth, which is really kind of very unlikely in an economy like the Philippines. So you can see that these measures have had an impact on growth. And we are starting to observe some interesting patterns with how economies are reacting to life in lockdown. And one thing that we looked at HSBC is a type of technological readiness score. This basically takes a whole variety of factors, the connection speeds, the share of the population has access to broadband, a high-speed internet, e-commerce share online, and that basically allows us to come up with a ranking for an economy's technological readiness, which is a good indicator for its ability to work from home, sustain essential business activity and services and non-services, even outside of a traditional retail environment. And you can see economies like Philippines, Indonesia, India are actually at the very bottom of this scale for the countries that we look at. And actually, this correlates very well with the degree of resilience in private consumption. So for example, if you look at Malaysia and Thailand, they actually have similar levels of technological readiness as Italy, for example. So that's why if you look at the private consumption in the first quarter, the latest high frequency data for these two economies, it's relatively more resilient than Philippines and Indonesia, which, obviously for obvious reasons, large rural populations, other development indicators haven't had the ability to invest as much in this type of technological preparedness for a wide share of the population. So a very clear takeaway for policymakers going forward is, of course, going to be to increase the resilience, particularly when it comes to technology, to allow the economies, let's say, to weather these types of episodes better in the future. And we do look at, of course, some indicators for, the share of the economy in some sectors. So, if you look, for example, at concerts, sporting events, holidays, amusement parks, these are going to be the sectors, of course, given the ability to replace them, that are going to take the longest to recover, particularly tourism as well, while maybe more simple services should rebound quite quickly. There are, however, some more optimistic signs coming from countries in the region. So this data here looks at the number of flights tracked at major airports across the region. And you can see with lockdowns, flight activity has collapsed since early March. But I'd actually like to point your attention to Vietnam, which is the orange line, which is of the latest readings is the highest. Actually, at early March, flights that were tracked in Hanoi Airport close to 200 a day, and actually already back to around 150. So because the Vietnamese government, for example, was able to contain the virus relatively well, and it's seen as credible among the population, actually they've been able to restore domestic travel a bit quicker than some were expecting. So to be clear, for sure, tourism and travel is going to be one of the latest industries to recover. But when there are signs that the virus has been successfully contained within a country, you can see that consumers are perhaps moving back to normalcy a bit quicker than some expected. Now, to talk about the policy response in a larger picture, the good news about this crisis, now the bad news is, of course, it's unprecedented. It's the largest economic contraction in recent modern economic history for most of these countries, usually kind of paralleling or quite close to the Asian financial crisis. But what's interesting is how quickly the fiscal response has been, and particularly when we compare the global financial crisis. So the red is the degree of stimulus or deficits during COVID-19. The gray is during the global financial crisis. And you can see not only is the amount much larger in most countries in the region, in the case of the Philippines, more than 2 times policy response, but it's happened a lot quicker as well across the board. So this type of spending is really crucial in allowing economies to come back quicker than would otherwise be the case. And we, by and large, have been impressed with the speed of policymaker approaches across the region. And it's not just fiscal spending and or simply rate cuts. It's actually the ability for monetary and fiscal policy to move in tandem. So for example, if you look at this chart here on the right-hand side, this is from a few weeks ago, but basically the gray is total budget stimulus, so additional spending because of COVID. And then on right next to that, you can see measures by central banks. So in the case of the Philippines, we've seen RRR injections as well as a repo, whereby the central bank is basically helping to remove pressure on the government bond market to basically keep yields contained and prevent any financial pressure from forming. So, it's not just developed markets that have been doing QE or conventional monetary policy. We've actually seen unconventional policies in every economy in the region. Most impressive, or at least most interesting, has been Indonesia, where the central bank actually considers its own policies as being a type of QE. So this would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, but that's how shows you how quickly things have moved. And I think we are particularly, impressed with the BSP's approach. They've been taking things, I think, in a relatively measured way. They've been kind of clearly communicating their policies when it comes to, for example, any bond purchases in secondary market, or, for example, the RRR injections. I think this has still been done in a measured way that should prevent at least yields from picking up too quickly and creating financial issues. But the next thing to be looking at, particularly in the next few years, is how governments are able to basically restrain spending, get spending back into a more normal trend to preserve ratings in the future. Now, just to end my remarks before we go to question, I want to talk about a bit of a broader subject, and that is the future after COVID. The good news, even if we get out quickly, it's also bad news, and that is that FDI in Southeast Asia has been a very important driver of growth. And the latest indicators suggest that CapEx is being curtailed. And also because of this rise in protectionism, more US-China trade tensions, it looks like the stock of global FDI flow may decrease. So while the good news is that ASEAN has been doing relatively well in the last few years, gaining share vis-a-vis China, somewhat benefiting, you could say, in some countries at least, from the US-China trade tensions, actually, when it comes to reforms to attract more FDI, it's absolutely imperative that countries continue to push through here. So when we came into 2020, we really looked at Indonesia and Philippines as the two economies that could do quite a lot in terms of reforms. In the case of the Philippines, the second bit of tax reform, corporate tax cut, streamlining business incentives, that's really very important because we know that Philippines receives relatively little FDI in Asia. And actually, if you're kind of overhauling your tax regime, that actually restricts FDI in the short term because businesses aren't really clear what type of benefits they're going to be getting. So hopefully, once conditions normalize in the Philippines and once Congress is back running at a normal pace, we hope to see the completion of these reforms, not only in the Philippines, but also in Indonesia, because FDI is going to be a lot harder to come by in the coming years. And it's really essential that countries address the structural deficiencies sooner rather than later. So that's a few quick remarks from my end. I look forward to discussing a bit further in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Joseph. That was a rapid flyover of a lot of very important information, and I think your concluding point about the kinds of things that are needed to prepare for the recovery. Let me switch it to Cesar. I mean, ASEAN as a regional organization hasn't been at the forefront really. It's taken some actions on COVID-19, but most of the pandemic response has been, I would say, nationally driven. From your perspective, Cesar, can you comment on the impact and also perhaps touch on what role ASEAN should be playing and how the region can chart a recovery path going forward?
Thank you, Don, and good afternoon to our viewers and to my fellow panelists. Joseph mentioned that the Philippine lockdown has been the strictest. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, we're on our 77th day. And unfortunately, economies are not meant to be on standstill. And that's why we will have a major challenge, because not even during World War II did we have economies on standstill. The same as we're seeing it in ASEAN, the important sectors are hit. The very sectors that brought ASEAN to where it was are also the ones that are hurting. For example, trade. as you know, the vision for ASEAN is really to be the hub of global trade in Asia. And since we're on standstill, that's gone down dramatically. ASEAN is one of those big beneficiaries to free trade agreements. The other area that ASEAN was doing well before the lockdown was tourism and travel. That's also going to hurt us quite substantially. Consumption has been hurt as well. Philippines and the other areas, that's a major driver for our GDP, about 60% of GDP, with the simultaneous decline in both supply and demand, and the increase in number of people that are unemployed, as well as the uncertainty about the future. Consumption is certainly taking a hit. Capital outflows, there's been quite a number of money that's been going out of the region. For emerging markets, it's been estimated that over $100 billion has gone out so far. In Indonesia, for example, I think they have over $8.2 billion that's gone out. Remittances. Philippines is a major recipient of remittances during the global financial crisis. That actually was steady, but this time around, I don't think it will be so because of the impact from the different areas of strength among the seafaring sector, among the U.S. residents where the unemployment is at historic highs, in the hospitality sector. Philippines, Vietnam, and some other countries are reliant on remittances. On commodity prices, as a result of the slack in demand, commodity prices are down, and you have Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei dependent on that. Obviously, we will now be running deficits that are much higher than what we are hoping before the crisis we would have. And that's just to survive the current phase of the crisis. And we're not even looking at the next few phases. You asked about the role of ASEAN so far. The Council of Foreign Relations has said that ASEAN has played a backseat so far. They've not really been very visible, unlike the EU, because the ASEAN organization has really been quite small. And so far, the countries have been reacting to this crisis on a national basis. In fact, the more we react nationally, I think the less relevant ASEAN will become. Even the countries, the travel bans, we didn't even coordinate with each other. So to be able to get out of this crisis, we hope ASEAN can step up, because we got ourselves in the map because we were ASEAN, not as individual countries. Individually, we're small, except probably Indonesia. We need to work together in three areas: in coordinating our health responses moving forward, in preparing for the economic recovery, and in seizing the silver linings that come out of this crisis. On the health responses, I hope that we take advantage of technology so that ASEAN can initiate a health passport, digital health passport, that has the same and is recognized across ASEAN. That way, for example, we can restart travel and tourism intra-ASEAN. Before the crisis, that accounted for about 34% of travel and tourism. We can also help facilitate tracing and tracking. Harmonizing testing standards and protocols, coordination of travel restrictions. Those are some of the things that ASEAN can initiate so that across ASEAN, we can facilitate the restart of travel and tourism. On the economic recovery part, prior to the COVID-19 crisis, intra-ASEAN trade was at about 24% of total trade. As you know, probably one of the reactions of the major economies to this crisis is, and major companies, is to shorten supply chain. And that will mean rejigging global supply chains to, with preference to near source suppliers. And that can affect ASEAN as a major part of the global supply chain. And the solution to that is really to tap the potential of the ASEAN market. And we can do this by harmonizing our standards because our trade really has been mostly intermediate goods as part of global supply chains. I think it's time that we start focusing on final consumption goods. And that we should start by harmonizing standards, removing the non-tariff barriers, even though the tariffs rates in ASEAN is very low. The number of non-tariff barriers has increased over the years. We should also improve ASEAN connectivity, both physical and digital. And we should also increase or sign more of the mutual recognition agreements so that more of the services can be done across ASEAN. This is the opportunity that's before us. And this is, I think, a crucial thing to do. It may not be politically wise because with crises like this, politics tend to look more inward to protect your own market. But I think by looking outward, in the end, I think we can help ourselves. The silver lining here also, and Joseph mentioned it, is the preparing our economies for the digital age. Basically, the crisis has pressed the fast forward button on digitalization, and we've seen it in the Philippines, even though based on Joseph's chart, we're one of those countries on the right side with which are not yet ready, but even telehealth, education, groceries, financing. Now everyone has no choice but to use the internet to be able to do these things. And this is a silver lining. The price of this lesson has been very expensive, and we must learn from it. E-government, I think, is the other thing to make government across ASEAN more efficient. One of the things that ASEAN Secretariat can really help out in this regard is really make operational the national single window. This should facilitate trade among ASEAN countries. You only register your goods once and automatically you can move it across ASEAN. Having a common tariff border among the large ASEAN countries, I think is a good first step. And then having a common tariff barrier among the smaller CLMB or CLM countries, I think will also improve that. And then an effective electronic cross-border payment infrastructure. That should also help, because if doing, when you talk to procurement people here in the Philippines, they find it easier to buy goods from China rather than from our neighboring countries, or even from the US or Europe. And that's because of this handicaps. Without addressing this, I think it would be very hard to take advantage of the fact that we're part of ASEAN. And if you don't do this, ASEAN will be I think marginalized because everyone will try to put up walls and try to do what is politically correct rather than what is the smarter thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great set of observations, and I think you actually posed some very good points there that leads nicely to call on Dr. Rebecca now. Cesar has raised a number of points that I think you as a trade professional and diplomat have been working on in a number of years in the ASEAN context, and of course in a bigger multilateral context. And so please, Dr. Rebecca, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about about the recovery, but in particular, how about those ideas that Sozar just shared about trying to make ASEAN a more effective place for trade within ASEAN and make that 24% go up and make those barriers go away.
Yep. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to share with you some of my thoughts. For me, as Asia slowly but surely moves to ease restrictions and restart the economies, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we unpause or do we go for a reset? I don't see unpausing as the way forward, because unpausing, it's going back to business as usual, and I don't think that's where we want to go. So for ASEAN, it has to be about now taking this opportunity to reflect on where we are, what lessons have we learned, and what do we do to reset our economies. So it's really, as Joseph also mentioned, it's about readiness or preparedness, and clearly looking at the developments from a risk management mindset. So let me just say that, let me leave that as the big framework. And I want to make just 3 points. The first one, and this has been talked about by both Joseph as well as Cesar, the digital economy in ASEAN, the focus on the digital economy in ASEAN. ASEAN has been talking about this for the longest time. All the time that I was working on ASEAN, the digital economy was there, but now it's in your face. We cannot delay the whole implementation and looking at how we implement the digital economy. Just some numbers here. In 2019, ASEAN's internet economy surpassed $100 billion, tripling in size over the past 4 years. By 2025, this is not even taking into account the pandemic. By 2025, it's expected to hit $300 billion US. We have a youthful demographic. We have a fast-growing middle class. We have, the rates of digital adoption is quite fast in the region. The entrepreneurial spirit, we have that in ASEAN. So we have a lot of things going for us, but we also have some risks, and these risks are from a more policy perspective. Cybersecurity laws that tend to be more restrictive, data localization requirements, data privacy, data security concerns. These, even as we talk of how important e-commerce has become in these last few months, we have to look at issues of privacy, of e-commerce regulations. ASEAN as a whole need to address this. If you have this varying approach to e-commerce through your policies and laws, then you stymie your development and your progress in these areas. ASEAN endorsed the digital integration framework in 2019 to 2025. Now, there's again, the frameworks are there. ASEAN has got this. ASEAN has in 2016, for example, the ASEAN telecommunications and IT ministers adopted the framework on personal data protection. In 2018, we endorsed the ASEAN framework on digital data governance. So if you look at what ASEAN has in terms of the infrastructure, it's all there. The architecture's there. It's just whether we implement this and how fast we implement our commitments. So that's something that ASEAN needs to work on, and work on fast, work with the private sector to ensure that we can overcome all these challenges that we faced in this, going forward, the digital economy is what will help get us out of this and really thrive if we want to see ourselves growing. You've seen examples of how the digital economy works, not just for e-commerce, but also for health, for education, people working from home. All these are being facilitated by the digital economy. So a lot more attention, a lot more focus on this will help us cross that barrier. The second point is on supply chains. I know Cesar also talked about it. Supply chain resilience is where ASEAN, the rubber will meet the road for ASEAN. We've seen it, we've experienced, it's not like this is something new. We experienced this during the Fukushima, incident, where supply chains, especially for the auto sector, was completely disrupted. So these are lessons that we've learned. Now, how do we take forward the lessons that we've learned? How do we look at diversification to build the strength of our supply chains? Where is structural reform in all this? ASEAN has done work on structural reform. We need to be more serious about it and focus on structural reform. How we performed up to 2019 is not going to get us through going forward. Yes, we've put in place the blueprint, the economic blueprint for 2015, the 2025. I think it's time to revisit those because the parameters, the assumptions on which those blueprints were built on have changed given this in-your-face crisis that we're facing on various fronts. So what worked in the past cannot work going forward. If we're going to focus on market access, I know Cesar talked about non-tariff measures. We have, again, talked about it. There's work that's being done on how to manage the non-tariff measures. It's really now about implementing this. And in the light of what has been going on and what has happened, it's no more, taking the ASEAN way and waiting for us to have consensus and then moving forward. The cavalier way of doing things cannot cut it anymore. We have to have that sense of urgency if we are to recover. And in this context, then, what Cesar said makes a lot of sense. For me, what I find sometimes frustrating is that push from ASEAN, the leadership. This is an opportunity for ASEAN to really, show leadership in these areas. And this is something that we shouldn't pass on. Just let it pass away just like that. We need to take hold of the situation and have that leadership. ASEAN +3, we have worked on ASEAN +1 FTAs, ASEAN +3 FTAs. How do we build on them? How do we ensure that these get implemented in the spirit that we wanted them to be implemented, and in that process strengthen our supply chains? And my third point, and this one is something that is the time has come for this. RCEP was designed to look at all the areas that Cesar talked about, mutual recognition agreements, customs procedures, facilitating trade, facilitating investment. These are all embedded in RCEP, and that would encompass the ASEAN +6. This for me is where ASEAN has an opportunity to show leadership. RCEP has been on the table. I was one of the early ones who got together to think through the architecture for RCEP. And we had this plan because it works if we put our hearts and soul and look beyond politics and focus on economics. Focus on what kind of benefits you can get out of for the business community, for small and medium enterprises, for creating the competitive environment that we want in ASEAN, so the transparent, predictable rules for ASEAN +6 for our trading partners. So RCEP is on the verge of being concluded and signed. I think there's a lot of will to have it signed this year. Unfortunately, you may not have India in the mix. That's something that ASEAN needs to work on again, to see how you can make it possible to have India in that mix. India is an economy that is going to grow. Today, sometimes the tendencies for negotiators is to focus on the today. And for me, I think it's not just about focusing on the today, but on the potential that can come from this agreement. So if we look at it static, from a static perspective, as opposed to a dynamic perspective, then we get ourselves tied in and limit the possibilities from that particular agreement. Now, if we spend a bit of time thinking about the future and the benefits that come from such an agreement, where we engage our trading partners and looking at rules that will be more transparent, more predictable for the region, it will be ultimately good for business. Likewise, linking this, really thinking through the possibility of an ASEAN EU FTA. I'm not going to go down that road so much, but I think it is not something that we should treat lightly or dismiss so easily, that we should look at the potential that can come from these engagements, because they will help you diversify your supply chains, build supply chain resilience as well. And at the end of the day, look at a set of rules that work for the region. You know, I mean, multilateral rules, always the best alternative, but sometimes that takes a long time. Like-minded economies, like-minded countries in the region should band together and ensure that, you know, we work to ensure that this is the region. This region will be the anchor, the pivot going forward, and an opportunity for ASEAN to provide the leadership that is so badly needed today. Thank you, Don.
Well, thank you. And you've teed up a lot of, you've given us a lot of energy there, and you've used the word urgency a couple of times. We've got some good questions have come in, and I think you've set the stage for that nicely. I'll read one of them. This is a question from Europe. One of the founding fathers of the European Union, Jean Monnet, said that Europe will be forged in crises and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises. Given its weak institutions, who will spur and drive ASEAN to take advantage of this crisis and put in place the many suggestions and solutions that now Cesar and you, Dr. Rebecca, have identified to avoid ASEAN being less relevant in the future? I mean, I put it in the context of who, and maybe not individuals, but this question about the 24%, I remember, I don't know, probably in the original blueprint that one of the ones you drafted, that intra-ASEAN trade number has been about flat for a decade, but the target has been to double. You know, who or what mechanisms are needed to create a way of breaking through some of these issues that are consistently talked about and not dealt with?
I think the natural right now is the chair of the ASEAN. And I can't remember who it is. Is it Thailand or?
Vietnam.
It's Vietnam.
It's Vietnam, okay. So it is the chair of, I think they should rejig the agenda that they prepared last year, because that is no longer relevant, updated, to really focus on the challenges and the opportunities as a result of the crisis. Now, unfortunately for ASEAN, we don't have a Germany who can fund, you know, a bigger ASEAN secretariat. But I think with the political will and the foresight, you know, we can make do and I mean move forward with some of these opportunities.
If I can just add, ASEAN as APEC, it is chair driven. So whoever is chairing it drives the agenda. So this is a time really for ASEAN to relook its agenda going forward. Is this system of, you know, the agenda being driven by a chair's priorities, is that relevant now? So really that's something for the grouping to think through. Is that the way, or should we have at the beginning a collective priority, a collective vision? Yes, we have the blueprint, which is providing that overarching framework, but when the chair takes its position, it has its priorities on how and where it wants to focus. So this is an area, and the ASEAN also was very intentional in that it didn't want a very strong secretariat, unlike the EU. You know, so for ASEAN, it is still a very member-driven organization. A lot of the competencies are still at the national level and not with the secretariat, unlike the EU. The commission has a lot of say. And that's why the response to COVID has been different when you compare ASEAN with the EU, because of the commission, the strength and the competence that have been given to the commission versus the secretariat. So it would be a good time, an appropriate time to relook the whole idea of how this organization is run. It is, I mean, it's a very high level thing. I know that this year the question also arises is, will the leaders be able to meet? It's a very logistical thing. You know, can they meet? Can they meet virtually and sort out some of these issues? So these are questions that will have to be managed by not just the secretariat, but the chair.
I'd like to add very quickly, and I really like where this conversation has gone in the last few minutes. And if you look at ASEAN, for example, the blueprint for 2025 AC or the various working groups, actually everything is thought out. There's already a proposition on e-commerce, digitization. It's great, everything is there. But unfortunately, you don't see the same excitement at the national level. And I think you really need to see political leaders really get more excited about ASEAN, understand that the success of ASEAN is really fundamental for the individual country's success. And we know in Asia's development economic history, right, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, mainland China, at the end of the day, it's still an export, industrial, FDI-driven story. And especially now with India coming into the fold and trying to compete a bit more, ASEAN has to be united in this regard. Even in the biggest ASEAN country, Indonesia, close to 300 million people, that's large, but India's over 1 billion. So if there's not the promise of the ASEAN market and of that access, the FDI proposition is so much lower. And unfortunately, competition is going to intensify. So we really need to see this resolved in the next few months.
So we had two different visions for how to set a vision. One is chair-driven, and the other is collective vision. I think you may have seen, I know we circulated there was a very strong initiative in the last few weeks among the business community. And I say the business community in a very broadest sense. We had the ASEAN Business Advisory Council representing ASEAN business, the East Asia business. We had young entrepreneurs, business councils, Europe, Russia, UK, US, India, everybody was on the same page and put out a statement saying pretty much exactly what both Cesar and Dr. Rebecca said, is that this is a unique time, urgency is required. The world is looking to relocate these supply chains, diversify them, make them more resilient, not have a single source of supply. ASEAN needs to make breakthroughs, so recommended creating a special commission of some kind. It's not a permanent thing, but a group that can be tasked with an urgent effort to put together recommendations to do some breaking through thinking on these things you're talking about. But some sort of mechanism beyond what the current business as usual is, because the situation isn't, as you've said, business as usual. I mean, does there need to be something different to catalyze, action beyond what we've already seen, or do you think a chair will just suddenly be inspired? How could we move forward? Because I think the difference between this conversation and many others that we've all been in over a decade or more in this subject is that it's just more passionate, but there's no specific idea of how to. I mean, non-tariff barriers, as you raised, still going, it's triple or something what it was 15 years ago. And the mechanism for breaking through those is not clear. So I'm just wondering what is it, do you think the crisis itself will wake people up, or do you think some other body needs to step up or be created in order to try to put some new ideas on the table?
The challenge for ASEAN is resources, right? And sometimes when you have a weak organization, once in a generation, there's a leader that comes that despite the challenges in resources is able to give that organization a more outsized impact on the agenda. And I think ASEAN is looking for such a leader. Unfortunately, it's on a rotation basis. I don't know again whose turn it is. But just imagine if the leader for ASEAN is someone like George Yeo or Dr. Marty of Indonesia. Those that have first a believer in ASEAN, but they have the communication skills, the ability to influence political leaders, and can actually deal with heads of states on an equal basis, despite the weakness of the center. I think that's what we're looking for. In the meantime, that we don't have those. We're really hoping that the leaders of ASEAN step up, just like the leaders of ASEAN in the 60s, 70s, and 80s stepped up to create ASEAN in the first place. And that's what we're looking for.
I think it's, for me, it's a collective, the strength of the collective. Yes, you may not have an outstanding leader, but the ability to pull resources together, and more importantly, the voice of the business community. I know you said that you've put it out there, but sometimes you need to keep repeating and repeating that message till it hits home. You know, as the other, when Malaysia was chair of ASEAN, what we found was we needed to bring the business councils together. There were many disparate business organizations in ASEAN, and each with its own agenda. So Donald, if I heard you right, this is the first time you're having all of them together on the same page, which is not necessarily, you know, has not necessarily been the case in the past. So, but we need to have more of that. We need the businesses, the voice of the businesses to be heard at the very highest level. So the thing is, if you go through a process, you go to the national level, then you go to the secretariat, then you go to the ministers, then you go to the leaders. I mean, it doesn't cut it. I mean, really, it will be too slow. So let me just give you an example. I'm not necessarily saying this is the best, but the APEC Business Advisory Council, what they did was they did it simultaneously. They sent everything out to the media, to the leaders, to the ministers at the same time. So, you know, you get all this pressure coming in from different parts of society, so that you wake up to the reality that you cannot be going through a process. At the end of the day, with civil servants, you're dealing with civil servants, policymakers are civil servants. We love process and procedures. We need to break that, you know, and this is how you do it. You engage, you make a lot of noise, you go through different channels and make sure your voice is heard. For me, I think that's the best way to do it. If you want to move and you want to make a difference, you want to see ASEAN come up to speed.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, we're trying to, I think everybody's this time, I don't think we've ever had a broader group sign a more forceful statement than this. Everybody seems to be on board with it. I think the question is, you know, we're looking for that place to latch in this very, very large set of committees and processes and procedures where you actually can have an impact. Let me switch just to maybe, you know, and by the way, there've been some other good suggestions along the lines that have come in some of the chat, which are to possibly, would it make sense to have regional institutions that take care of specific subjects and with an agenda to move forward, whether it's health care or supply chains or digital transformation, and so forth. So, you know, I think that's a kind of an idea that's somewhere in the midst of what we were just talking about, somewhere between the leadership takes and collective. You need something to carry on. Let me just switch to one other last question, if I may, before we have to moving toward winding up. This question relates to, I would say, sustainability. ASEAN has achieved tremendous economic growth by focusing on growth at all costs. This was at huge social and environmental price. In resetting ASEAN economies post-COVID, how can business and governments work together to grow the economy, taking into account social and environmental impact? How to reset with responsible business conduct playing an important role, will it be possible? And I would suggest to throw in, what should the private sector be bringing to that discussion? I mean, anybody can take a first shot at that.
I guess if I were to start, I could say we are already seeing some signs of, for example, the mining industry. Both Philippines and Indonesia, politically, it was understood that these is, you know, quite deleterious for future growth. It was very bad for the environment, and they wanted to move to kind of higher value added in those sectors. So that's one area where perhaps we've seen some shift. And in the case of Indonesia, they were able to kind of incentivize some initial signs of electric vehicle supply chains, basically using the domestic nickel for this type of value add to be less pollutive as opposed to just extracting from the ground. So that's perhaps one area. And I think just the key is ASEAN needs to really focus on these industries of the future. It already has a very big electronic supply chain, semiconductors, which we use more than ever before. We really need to see more supply chain consolidation, more non-tariff barriers, if we're going to move into more of these kind of advanced types of manufacturing.
The green economy is actually an opportunity to jumpstart the ASEAN economy post-COVID. Unlike other regions, the ASEAN infrastructure is not yet as well developed. Take the case of, say, the Philippines or Indonesia, that are very large archipelagos. Basic infrastructure like electricity is not yet well established in the most remote areas, and clearly the traditional approach of having them connected to the main supply grid is beyond the financial wherewithal of the country. So this is where small solar packages can actually transform the lives of communities, make them connected digitally, and actually also help them access and be connected to the supply chains through that. That's just a small example of the opportunities that we have thinking about the green economy. The decentralization of urban centers offer us this opportunity as well. One of the things that I think we realize now is over-concentration in one area can make us very vulnerable, and therefore we have to start spreading growth across the country. And in doing so, we will be mostly working with greenfields, and therefore try to use that and build that on a more sustainable basis. The movement right now, I guess what we realize that we can actually work from home will also be actually good in terms of reimagining how we design our cities to address this new reality. So I would say that this is an opportunity to actually create another avenue at sparking the restart of the economy post COVID. Governments actually will have to take the lead here. For example, just if we can somehow jumpstart e-government, make it easier to start a business, that will go a long way in encouraging entrepreneurship again, despite the fear, the vicious cycle of fear that we're in right now. So clearly, you mentioned businessmen, government also is the one that really has to step up. This will be the most important PPP of our lives to get back out of this crisis that we're in.
Yeah, I just, John, just to add a concluding, I'm very aware of the time. The other group that needs to be engaged, yes, we need to engage with the business community, but we need to engage civil society, especially when it comes to issues of governance, sustainability, the green economy, the circular economy, the role of the civil society and the media, how we communicate initiatives that we're doing. This are the other part that needs to be engaged.
Thank you. Well, I think we've, I didn't think an hour would go this quickly, but it sure has, and we've covered a lot. I want to thank all three of our speakers, and I think it's been a conversation where there's been a lot of shared ground, a lot of alignment around the theme of ASEAN being a region of tremendous potential, that we're in a situation that ought to call for new leadership thinking to break through some old barriers that are making change too slow, and to take advantage of opportunities. The biggest ones I think everyone has talked about are now that supply chains are going to be reoriented around the world away from single source and looking to be resilient. This is a great opportunity if ASEAN can break down the barriers within the region for attracting a lot of that investment. And also by breaking down barriers and being better working and building up our digital capabilities, that we can energize the 650 million potential consumer market, which of course will also bring with it more investment, technology, innovation, et cetera. So great opportunities, several great ideas about how to keep the pressure on and look for ways that the business community can be united and put forth ideas that forcefully. I think we're still searching for that hook that we can plug into and find the kindred spirits in a way to move things forward, and we'll keep doing that. And we certainly appreciate Cesar and Dr. Rebecca and Joseph, your leadership and your thinking, and also a lot of ideas, I think, that give us encouragement, and we will come back to you for further advice as we chart our way forward. Thank you all very much. And we could clap if we had a clap function, but anyway,
Yeah.
89 people around the world are clapping.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Let me just very briefly, to wrap us up, just mention two things, housekeeping things, which our Executive Director, Chris Humphrey, reminded me this morning that I should do. One is that we have launched our annual business sentiment survey, which is an effort to take the business sentiment temperature, so to speak, of European businesses across the ASEAN region. We've done that now for several years. It's a very useful piece of work, and if you go to our website, there's a pop-up. It's very easy to respond to the survey, and of course all those who respond will get a copy of it, which I think it's a very useful analysis, you'll see. And this year will be particularly interesting. It's been extraordinarily positive the last few years. We'll see how we do. The second thing I want to mention is another webinar on June 11th, Thursday at 4 p.m., which is a pan-regional, if you will, fly around where each of the chambers of commerce, the European Chambers of Commerce executive directors, are going to be reporting on COVID, the situation and the recovery outlook from each of the economies from each of the countries in the region. So that's on June 11th. So if you want to get an up-to-date, on the ground report from how things are looking, there's an opportunity to do that and an opportunity again to ask questions. Again, thank you very much to our speakers and everybody who made this call possible. And good luck and stay safe to everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe, Joseph.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Cesar. Bye, Joseph. Bye, Dawn.
Bye-bye.